Hi, I'm Andrew Kane, politics editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. With me today are reporter Anna Bryson and Dave Ress and Charlotte Renee Woods from our politics team. We're here to talk about the week that was in Virginia politics. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover, but we'll start with Charlotte. Charlotte, we had a lot of folks who showed up at the Capitol this week to talk about abortion, and it's interesting because a lot of people feel passionate about it, but it looks like, given the split in the legislature, not a lot is going to happen right now. Tell us a little bit about the event, the March for Life, and then where legislation stands.
Yeah, several hundred people showed up. It's certainly one of the bigger gatherings I've seen so far this session, because almost every day there's some kind of gathering that happens, usually by the bell tower. Yeah, it's obviously a very, very divisive topic. It's a very personal topic, and I have heard so many stories from women sharing how they chose to have an abortion, and stories from women sharing at the march the other day about how they chose not to have one. For instance, one woman was talking about how for her it was important, even though she was recommended to have one, it was very important for her to still carry the baby to term and grieve the process of being able to bury it. It's a very, very personal topic for a lot of women and people who are pregnant to choose what to do or not do. Meanwhile, though, it doesn't look like the government's going to be telling people where they can choose or not this year, because a lot of abortion restricting bills have already been defeated in the Senate, and there's some bills in the House that haven't even been taken up yet. I think people just are aware that it's an election year, and I think we'll see more traction in 2024 pending how votes shake out. Just a reminder, primaries and conventions will be happening this coming summer. That's when there's more candidates on the slate, so pay attention to them, figure out where they stand on this topic if it's a huge, important issue for you, and then vote again in November.
It's interesting that on the House side, where Republicans control the chamber, they're not even going to take up some of the abortion legislation, such as the House version of the governor-backed bill to bar most abortions after 15 weeks, with exceptions for rape, incest, and when the mother's life is in jeopardy. And there's another bill that they're not taking up that would talk about that life begins at conception. So.
Yeah, so it mirrors what we're seeing. Representative Bob Good introduced the Life at Conception Act in Congress. Delegate Marie March has a very similar one. Amanda Chase had a very similar one. Travis Hackworth in the Senate had a very similar one that's been defeated. And I think it's also worth noting, while at the March for Life rally this week, Attorney General Jason Miyares said that it's important, or at least he feels it's important, not to prosecute if abortions do become restricted or illegal. Meanwhile, some of these bills, like Hackworth's, outlined prosecution. So I think it just goes to show how much of a spectrum there is on whether you're supporting abortion access or restrictions or bans. There's just so many shades of gray in there.
Yeah, and even within the parties, there's differentiation. I was struck by something that the governor said during the March for Life. The governor talked to some of the folks who gathered for the march, and he said that he was disappointed with Senate Democrats and who defeated a number of these bills to allow abortion restrictions. And the governor said that he was struck by the fact that Virginians, after all, had elected a pro-life governor. And that was interesting to me because, of course, in the presidential election, Americans elected a president who happens to be pro-choice, but we don't expect Republicans like Congressman Bob Good to give up their prerogatives differing with the president on the issue. So this sort of gets to the notion of a lot of governors come in and think they have a mandate when people in the legislature don't necessarily see it that way.
Well, yeah, and Governor Youngkin had, I went back about 20 years, and he had really the narrowest margin of anyone. And I'm thinking of guys like Tim Kaine, who had, the governor had about a 2 percentage point over Terry McAuliffe. Go back a few years to Tim Kaine with a 6%, and I mean, he really struggled to get some stuff through the legislation. Mark Warner with a similar thing had to really work hard with the legislature to get some tax stuff through. Governors and legislators don't always get along that well.
Yeah, and governors only serve for 4 years in Virginia, as you know, and so legislators, some of them stick around for 20, 30 years even. So they think that they are the repository of power. So let's talk about some of the interesting issues that came up this week. Anna, you spent a lot of time for Wednesday and Thursday at the State Board of Education meeting, and they took up another iteration of the K-12 standards that for history, that a lot of folks are interested in. Tell us the latest of what's going on there.
Yeah, so it's been very contentious, and let me back up a bit. Last August, the State Board of Education was ready to vote on a set of standards that had been created over the course of nearly 2 years, about 20 months, with input from hundreds of entities. And then in August, State Superintendent Jillian Balow, appointed by Youngkin, said, hold on, these new appointees need some more time to read over the document before they accept for first review, which basically just means like the first step of the public comment process.
By appointees, you mean the governor's appointees to the Board of Education?
Yes, yeah, because they were new. So she said, hold on, they need a little more time to look this over. And she did say that there were going to be some changes to the document. The VDOE said they're going to be very, very minor changes. But then, of course, in November, the document that came out was a complete rewrite. There were a lot of issues with the document that, the administration admitted, this was not our best work. There are many mistakes.
The governor even acknowledged that there were omissions and errors, and he wasn't really happy with it.
Yeah, one of the ones that people talked about a lot was it referred to Native Americans as America's first immigrants, so that was a point of outrage for a lot of people. Also, things about the Civil War, it could be, the way that it was written in the November draft, it could be taken to seem like it was implying there's more, that slavery wasn't the main cause of the Civil War. So just things like that. And so then the administration said, okay, we're gonna take a look back at this, redo some things. And they basically said they were going to take the November draft, which is the Youngkin administration draft that had a lot of errors, and merge it with the August draft that had been created over a course of, nearly 2 years.
During the Northam administration.
Yes, and then sort of merge those together, which is what they did. And a lot of those mistakes are fixed. It's a more, you could say, wholesome, description of history. But that being said, a lot of people are still very upset about it. They don't think it's good enough. Public comment yesterday was about 4 hours long. About 70 people spoke about the history standards. 2 of them were in favor. The rest of them were very against the standards. Anyhow, in November, the State Board of Education, which is mostly Youngkin appointees, decided not to move forward on that draft that had a lot of errors. But yesterday, they decided to move forward on this second version of the draft that sort of blended the Youngkin draft with the other one that was developed under the Northam administration.
So what happens next?
Next, there's going to be a series of public comments set up in places around the state. Information on that is not out yet, but it's expected they'll make a lot of revisions to it. The Northam appointees on the board were not happy with the document. They voted against, having it move forward. A lot of the problems were with the introduction that had some things like Vice President of the board, Dr. Tammy Mann, took issue with the fact they described slavery as a stain on America's history, and she took that to mean sort of like a blemish that you could just sort of wipe off. So there are some little issues like that with the introduction, but at the end of the day, it moved forward as is.
And briefly, there's another significant issue that the State Board of Education took up regarding accountability. What's going on there?
Yes, so with accountability, Youngkin said late last year when the results came out from a national assessment that in Virginia, kids are not doing very well on, he said, okay, we're gonna overhaul the accreditation system because most schools are accredited and even though they're not performing well academically. So what they wanted to do was separate accountability from accreditation. The legislature did not end up introducing anything like that, but they are going to work on that for next session, then separate those out. But there are things they can do in the meantime, which they didn't lay out specifically at this meeting, but things like raising the cut scores, which is like the bar to pass state tests, is something they're thinking about.
And these are the standardized tests that kids take in math and in English, right? And reading.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good. Interesting. Dave, you've had a number of interesting things arise on your beat. We're getting to the point where a lot of the hot button issues are going away, and now we're getting down to the sausage making regarding both taxes and a big Dominion regulation bill. There's a really big development yesterday on the Dominion regulation. What happened there?
Well, the night before, the House of Delegates Commerce and Energy Committee was going to vote on basically a bill that Dominion wrote, and basically a bill that would, in effect, direct the State Corporation Commission to raise to increase the authorized profit rate that Dominion can earn, which then means increase the rates ratepayers pay. Well, the governor decided he didn't like this very much, and apparently stressed this point quite forcefully. So the House version of the bill was basically gutted. They took out the profit rate thing, they took out a couple other things, and basically left it looking very much like a simpler bill from Delegate Lee Ware from Powhatan and Republican, and Delegate Rip Sullivan, Democrat from Fairfax, that basically gives the SEC some more regulatory muscle over rates. And so we have a situation now where, as we head towards, well, the crossover, where each body looks at the other's bills, the Senate bill basically gives Dominion what it wants, the House bill doesn't. And that means, my guess would be, neither one is going to go through the way it looks now. And what the compromise will be, there's a lot of potential moving pieces, but I think the impact on ratepayers will be less than what the Dominion bill started out with, how much less, what it says about the power of the SEC to say what rates should be. I'm up in the air.
We're about 3 weeks out from the end of this session. I think it's 3 weeks from tomorrow. And so this weekend, the House Money Committee and the Senate Money Committee are going to pass their own chambers' versions of the budget amendments. And so, Dave, as part of this stew, there's probably going to be some hard bargaining on the governor's tax cut proposals as well.
Yeah, although that's going to go through this roughly the same way that the Dominion bill will. The Senate will vote on its version, and the Senate thinks that the tax cuts that the governor is proposing, those $1 billion worth of individual income and corporate tax reductions, they think that money should be better spent elsewhere. The House, Republican-controlled, thinks the governor's got a great idea. The House budget is going to basically incorporate what the governor wants. The Senate budget will not. The Senate budget will go to the House, which will replace it with its budget. The House budget will go to the Senate, which will replace it with its budget. There'll be at least 1 or 2 rounds of we insist on this, we insist on that, and then the real work begins, which is some of the most senior members of both bodies, both parties, will sit down and start doing some horse trading.
And before we close out, I wanted to note an interesting story that Dave's been working on about how there are some opportunities for what we call peace in the valley. Dave, you've been spotlighting some areas of bipartisanship. Why don't you tell folks some of those examples?
I think probably the most important was, for the first time in 20 years, we actually have an accord that's moving on setting staffing standards for nursing homes. There's a lot of times when you talk to people, I remember talking to Senator Tommy Norment about this. He said, well, what about bipartisanship? And he says, well, it's stuff that doesn't matter that much. He in fact, has got a bill co-sponsored with Jennifer McClellan, one of the more liberal Democrats in the Senate, about a very technical aspect of it, the conflict of interest law. Senator Norman was one of the 4 Republicans who voted for McClellan's child tax credit bill, which I think is going to be a major bargaining point in the tax standoff.
There's also some accord across the aisle on trying to help fix some problems with mental health.
Oh, yeah, no fooling. Those are really recondite. They're very hard to deal with. But we have a very conservative Republican from Albemarle County, Delegate Rob Bell, and a liberal Democrat from up in Bath County, Cree Deeds, who are moving the same bill. It's a little complicated, but it's about what happens if you're detained because you're in a mental health crisis, but before the period of detention expires, the crisis abates and you're in better shape. You know, do you have to be stuck there in detention, you know, basically have your rights deprived?
They would let you go under this.
Yeah, and you know, Bell is still working with Monty Mason, another Democrat from Williamsburg, on some very difficult issues which are probably not going to advance this session, but they're going to continue working on it together across the party line to see if there are other ways of, you know, when someone with a mental illness gets in a jam with the law, are there better ways of doing it than our current common practice of basically throwing you in jail for 30 days?
So the big picture is they're not always at loggerheads, even though the hot button issues get a lot of our ink, understandably. So we'll keep reporting on what's going to transpire over the next 3 weeks. And I want to thank Anna Bryson and Charlotte Renee Woods and Dave Rast for joining me, and encourage you folks to keep paying attention to our coverage on richmond.com and in the Richmond Times-Dispatch.